Wyoming Territory, August of 1879. The sun burned low and gold over the flat dust of Sweetwater County when the preacher's daughter was handed off like a sack of feed in front of half the town. Evelyn Joans stood in the middle of the dry dirt street, wrists red from the rope binding them, her dark blue dress torn at the hem. Her father, Reverend Josiah Jones, had just finished his speech. A woman who speaks over her husband, questions the word of God, and refuses a proper match is no daughter of mine, he announced. His voice carried with the wind. She's to be given away to whoever will have her. I will not house rebellion. She hadn't cried, not even when they dragged her from the church steps. She'd only looked toward the crowd, eyes scanning faces that wouldn't meet hers, except one. Dawson Flannery, a tall cowboy with wind-burned cheeks and a quiet drawl, stepped forward from where he'd been leaning against the corral rail. His hat was low over his eyes, but as he moved, the crowd parted. He walked like he had nowhere to be but here. His boots stirred up the dust. "I'll take her," he said simply. A murmur rolled through the people gathered. Someone laughed, nervous. Her father blinked, stunned. Dawson turned to her. "You all right with that?" Evelyn's chin lifted. "I am." "Then we're done talking." Dawson pulled a knife from his belt and cut the rope from her wrists. He took off his hat, looked at the preacher. "You won't touch her again." "She is no longer my concern," Reverend Jones spat. Dawson looked back at Evelyn. "You hungry?" She nodded. "Then let's go get married so you can eat as my wife." He did not wait for permission. He took her hand, gently, like she was already something precious to him, and led her to the small courthouse near the edge of town. The clerk there was half drunk and confused, but the paperwork was signed. The vows said. And Dawson slid his mother's wedding band onto Evelyn's finger with hands that did not shake. They walked out husband and wife not an hour after she'd been cast out like garbage. Dawson did not live in town. He had a cabin 20 miles west, near the foothills, surrounded by pine and peace. They rode out together on his wagon, quiet most of the way. Evelyn held her hands in her lap, staring at the cracked skin on her knuckles. She was bruised, tired, but she sat upright. "You do not have to be afraid," Dawson said, eyes ahead on the trail. "I am not," Evelyn answered. "Good. I do not like folks being afraid in my house." It was dark when they reached his land. The cabin was small, one room with a loft, but it smelled like cedar and clean air. He helped her down from the wagon, careful not to touch her more than necessary. "You'll sleep in the bed," he said. "I'll take the floor. It is your house. Now it's ours." She looked at him like she was measuring that word. Ours. He cooked a simple stew, thick with rabbit and potatoes. She ate 2 bowls, quiet and steady. He did not ask her about her father or the church. He only watched her. Later, when she sat near the fire, Dawson handed her a blanket. "Marrying you was not about pity," he said. "It was about right and wrong. I saw something rotten happening and I stepped in." Evelyn looked over at him. "You do not know me." "No," he said, "but I will." The next morning she rose with the sun, already making coffee when Dawson came in from feeding the horses. She wore one of his shirts, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back. "You do not have to serve me," he said. "I am not. I am doing what makes me feel human again." He nodded. "Then thank you." They worked side by side that day. Evelyn had grown up soft-handed in town, but she chopped wood like she meant to kill it. Dawson showed her how to gather kindling without cutting her palms open. They did not talk much, but the silences felt easy, like they were building something without needing to say the shape of it aloud. That night, Evelyn stood by the fire looking up at the stars through the open door. Dawson sat behind her cleaning his rifle. "My mother was like you," he said after a while. "Strong, too strong for the man she married." He left. "She raised me on her own." Evelyn turned to him. "I am sorry." Do not be. She taught me to see a woman's strength for what it is. She walked over, sat beside him. You married me to protect me, but you do not know what that means for you. My father will not forgive this. I do not need his forgiveness. Evelyn studied his face. You are not afraid of anything, are you? I am afraid of not doing the right thing when it matters. She smiled then, just a little. Days passed. Evelyn began to laugh again. Dawson taught her to ride properly, to mend tack, to shoot straight. She sang to herself when she swept the porch. He fixed her shoes when they wore thin. 2 weeks after the wedding, she came into the cabin after morning chores, cheeks red from the wind. You never asked what I said, she told him. He looked up from the table. What? To get me cast out. You never asked. I figured if you wanted to tell me, you would. She stepped closer. I said a woman has the right to question a man who claims to speak for God. I said he gave us minds to use. Dawson smiled. Sounds like truth to me. Evelyn moved to stand between his knees. He looked up at her, waiting. I want to stay married, she said, not just in name. His hands came to her waist, slow, sure. I do too. She leaned down and kissed him. It was not timid. It was a promise. That night they shared the bed for the first time. He held her like she was made of something rare. She curled into him like she had always belonged there. And when the sun rose, Evelyn Joans Flannery woke in her husband's arms, her heart full and her name finally her own. The first frost came early that year, curling silver over the porch rails and stiffening the creek that ran behind the cabin. Dawson rose before light, as always, and Evelyn stood at the stove, coaxing warmth from the coals she'd buried deep the night before. The cabin smelled faintly of tallow and juniper wood. You don't have to chop today, Dawson said, setting his hat on the peg by the door. Ground's too hard. I'll run stock fence along the south line instead. Evelyn didn't look up from the pan. I like the cold. Makes the work feel cleaner. He watched her for a moment, her profile outlined in the glow of the firebox. I know a woman in town who sews for trade. You could get a coat made proper. I can stitch my own sleeves longer, she said. I'd rather save the coin for a milk cow. He didn't argue. Instead, he took the biscuit she slid onto his plate and began eating with slow appreciation. She'd started using souring cream in the dough, and it had made them softer inside. That afternoon, while Dawson worked the fence line, Evelyn walked the tree line with a tin pail and a small hatchet. She gathered bark for dyeing, roots for tea, and a few late-season rose hips. Her dress snagged on a hawthorn branch and she paused, fingers brushing the frayed edge. Behind her, hooves cracked frozen leaves. She turned, hand tightening around the pail's handle. A man rode up slow, broad-shouldered, saddle worn, and older than Dawson by at least 20 years. His coat was army issue, faded blue with the buttons long gone. Reckon you're the one Dawson married, he said, voice rough like coffee left too long on the fire. Evelyn stayed still. Who are you? Name's Rafe Flannery, his uncle. She didn't lower her guard. Dawson never mentioned you. He wouldn't. Ain't seen each other in near 12 years. What do you want? He dismounted slow, like he meant no trouble, but he stood too close to the tree line to be casual. Came for land, he said. He's sitting on a good stretch of it, and I need to run cattle west come spring. Figured blood might mean he'd deal fair. Evelyn looked him over. His boots were cracked, his gloves stitched through the knuckles. He's out by the ridge, she said. You'll find him if you follow the fence. Rafe tipped his head, then hesitated. You're not what I expected. She didn't answer. That evening, Dawson returned later than usual, jaw tight, knuckles scraped raw. Your uncle came, Evelyn said, handing him a warm towel for his hands. He's not my kin, Dawson answered, wiping the blood from a cracked knuckle. He's a man who left my mother near broke after borrowing what little she had. Showed up now thinking he can take what he didn't earn. Evelyn poured water over the potatoes she'd set to boil. He said he wanted to run cattle west. He'll find another way. They ate in silence. Wind pushed against the shutters and the fire hissed when a knot popped in the log after the meal. Evelyn cleared the table and Dawson sat by the hearth pulling off his boots. His shoulders looked heavier than usual. He said I wasn't the sort you'd marry, she said after a moment. That I didn't look like I belonged here. Dawson raised his head, surprised. He said that to you, she nodded once. He stood and walked over, resting his hand lightly on her forearm. You belong more than anyone ever has. She looked up at him, eyes steady. Then tell me what you want from all this, not what you took on because it was right, what you want. He didn't answer right away. He tipped his head, watching her like he was measuring something long held quiet. I want a life built slow, he said. Built honest, with you in it. Her breath caught, but she didn't step back. Even if I never give you sons, he shook his head. Even if all we have is each other and a few hens, I didn't marry you for what might come. I married you because standing there that day, you looked like the only true thing I'd seen in years. She leaned into his palm, his hand still on her cheek now. Then we'll build it. Together they banked the fire, bolted the door, and lay down beneath the thick quilt she'd mended that morning, her stitches small and sure. The wind pressed against the windows, but inside the walls of the cabin, there was only warmth. Somewhere outside, a coyote called out once and then fell quiet. The night held. By late October, the wind had turned sharp and dry, carrying the scent of pine smoke and distant snow. Evelyn stood near the edge of the pasture. Sleeves rolled to her elbows as she worked an iron hook through the top rail of a gate Dawson had been meaning to fix. Her breath floated pale in the morning chill. He approached from the lower slope, arms full of fence posts stripped and ready. You planning to wrestle that latch all morning? I'd have it settled if the hinge weren't split, she said, glancing over her shoulder. I already filed the edge down. It's the pin that's warped. He set the posts down and knelt beside her, running a thumb along the iron. You're right. I'll cut a new one from the wagon axle. He glanced up. Why didn't you wait? I wanted it done before the snow comes. You've had your hands full with the shed roof. Dawson didn't answer right away. He stood and brushed the dust from his knees. You get tired of waiting on people, don't you? I learned not to. That night, she sat beside him at the table, mending the collar of a flannel shirt he'd torn on barbed wire. The lamplight cast soft gold over her face, and the thread moved through the fabric with steady rhythm. Dawson watched her for a while before speaking again. I got a letter today, he said. Sheriff brought it up from Green River. Evelyn lifted her eyes. From who? Not signed. Just said Reverend Joans is riding circuit again. Preaching in smaller camps east of here. She folded the shirt carefully and set it aside. He'll want to believe I'm suffering. You think he'll come this way? I think he'll send someone first. He won't risk spoiling his own name by showing his face in a place where people remember what he did. Dawson reached across the table, laying his hand over hers. You're not alone. I know, he waited. But, she took a breath. But if I ever have to stand in front of him again, I want it to be as someone he can't speak over. You already are. The next morning, she rode into town with Dawson to trade for winter seed and flannel. The general store was quiet, the bell above the door rattling in the wind as they stepped inside. Evelyn kept her shoulders straight, her chin lifted, though she felt the weight of eyes settle on her as they passed. Mrs. Tiller, the storekeeper's wife, came out from behind the counter, hands clasped in front of her apron. Evelyn, she said softly, how are you faring? Well enough. Mrs. Tiller glanced at Dawson, then back. You look strong. I am. After gathering what they needed, Dawson stepped outside to load the sacks. Evelyn lingered near the bolts of cloth, fingers trailing over a length of faded green calico. Mrs. Tiller walked over, voice low. "Your father's been sending word north," she said. "Letters to preachers, asking for support. He's saying he lost his daughter to sin." Evelyn didn't flinch. "Then he should have held on tighter." "He may try to reach you through the law. I'm married." Mrs. Tiller nodded. "And that might be enough, but you be careful. He sets traps with words, not fists." Outside, Dawson had finished tying down the last bundle. He helped Evelyn into the wagon without a word and waited until they were back on the trail before speaking. "I saw the way that woman looked at you. She's not the one I worry about. You don't have to worry at all." Evelyn's hands were folded in her lap, but her voice held steady. "I don't fear my father. I fear what he might stir up in others." Dawson kept his eyes on the trail. "Then let's be ready for it." The road home wound upward through dry pines and shale. As they crested the last rise, the wind picked up, scattering needles across the wagon bed. Evelyn reached for one of the bundles, tucking it tighter against the railing. "I'd like to plant rows of winter kale," she said, "and onions, something that holds through cold. You planning a full root cellar? I want something that will last." He looked over at her, the corner of his mouth pulling into something quiet and content. "Then we'll dig it deep." That evening she spread the seed packets on the table, arranging them by planting times. Dawson stood beside the hearth, sharpening the blade of the drawknife. "You never asked why I stayed unwed so long," he said. Evelyn didn't look up. "You'd have told me if you wanted to." He nodded once. "I never saw the point of joining lives with someone who didn't know the value of silence." She smiled to herself. "Then I suppose I was the first woman quiet enough for you." "No," he said, stepping closer. "You were the first woman whose quiet said something worth hearing." She turned to face him fully, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. "And what did you hear?" "That you'd already fought to keep your soul. You weren't about to give it up just to survive." Her eyes softened. "Neither were you." He set the blade down and reached for her, not with urgency, but with the kind of certainty that built barns and broke wild horses. She stepped into his arms, her forehead resting against his shoulder. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls again, but inside there was only the sure rhythm of two hearts that had found in each other the kind of quiet that didn't need to be filled. Evelyn tilted her face up. "I want our home to be a place where no one's voice is taken." "It already is," Dawson said, and kissed her like the promise it was. November brought snow that didn't melt by midday. It came quiet, blanketing the pasture and softening the sharp lines of the foothills. Evelyn stood at the window early one morning, hands wrapped around a tin cup, watching flakes drift sideways across the rise where Dawson had planted fence posts weeks before. The world looked hushed, like it was holding its breath. Behind her, Dawson was lacing his boots by the hearth. "There's elk sign near the creek bend," he said. "Might fill the smokehouse if I track right." Evelyn didn't turn from the window. "I can come," she said. "You'll lose light early." He paused, glancing up. "You sure I can carry? Or skin if it comes to that. You ever shot anything bigger than a jackrabbit?" She looked over her shoulder. "No, but I've watched things die slow. I'd rather make it quick." They set out before sunup, walking the ridge above the creek where the snow had crusted thin under their boots. Dawson moved with the quiet focus of someone raised to read land like scripture. Evelyn followed behind, rifle slung across her back, her breath ghosting out in pale curls. They found the tracks just past a line of cottonwoods, deep and spaced wide. Dawson crouched low, fingers brushing the impressions. He nodded once and rose again. "He's alone. Bull maybe 5 years. We'll keep high and circle wide." Evelyn didn't speak. She watched how he moved, how his eyes caught what hers missed: the snap of a branch, the shift of shadow in the brush. By mid-morning they spotted the elk across a shallow ravine, head down and shoulders broad. Dawson raised his rifle, then paused. "You want to try?" he asked, voice low. She hesitated, then stepped forward and took the rifle from him. He adjusted her stance gently, one hand at her elbow. "Breathe out," he murmured. "Then squeeze." The shot rang out, echoing off the hills. The elk staggered, then collapsed. They crossed the ravine in silence. Evelyn knelt beside the body, eyes on the rise and fall that had already stopped. "Does it ever feel wrong?" she asked. "Only when it's wasted." They dressed the elk quickly, hands working without hesitation. Blood soaked into the snow and steamed in the cold air. By the time they hauled the first quarter onto the sled, the sun had fallen behind the ridge. That night, they hung the meat in the shed, smoke curling slow from the chimney pipe. Evelyn washed her hands in water warmed over the fire, then sat at the table with a sheet of waxed paper and a stub of graphite. "What are you writing?" Dawson asked, folding his coat over the chair. "A list," she said. "Things we'll need come spring." He walked over, glanced down. She'd written carefully: seed, oilcloth, salt, pulleys, nails. "And you think of this after shooting your first elk." "I think of it because of that." "We'll need a better pulley system if we're to do this again." He leaned against the table. "You planning to stay through another winter then?" She looked up. "I'm planning to stay through all of them." Dawson's expression didn't shift, but something settled behind his eyes, like tension he hadn't named was finally gone. "Then I'll add something to the list," he said. "What?" "A proper door latch." "You deserve one that doesn't stick." Evelyn smiled faintly. "And maybe a second chair, for when we have company." They shared the last of the cornbread that night, eating in easy quiet. Wind scraped light across the shutters, but the fire held strong. After the dishes were done, Dawson stood at the window where she'd stood that morning. "You remember that first week?" he asked. "When you wouldn't sit unless I stepped outside?" "I remember," she said. "I was afraid you'd leave the first chance you got. I was afraid you'd want me to." He turned from the window and crossed the room to her. "I've wanted 1,000 things in my life, but none like this." Her breath caught. "Say it plain." "I love you," he said. "Not for what you survived. Not for what you do. Just for being the one I look at and know I'm home." Evelyn reached for him, and he came willingly, folding her against him with the surety of someone who'd been waiting to be chosen. Later, they lay side by side beneath the quilt, her hand resting over his heart. "Come spring," she whispered, "I want to build a row of blackberry cages along the south fence." He traced a line along her forearm. "We'll plant them deep, and when they fruit I'll make preserves. I'll build the shelves for them." She closed her eyes. "We'll fill them together." Outside, snow fell steady, covering tracks and fences and the path to the pasture. But inside, their life was already rooted in quiet promises, in shared weight, in love that had taken its shape slow and true. By early December, the snow had deepened enough to hush the world. The cabin stood half-buried beneath a thick white cover, smoke curling from the chimney in slow ribbons. Dawson had finished lining the roof with pine boughs to keep the ice from seeping through, and Evelyn had started boiling the last of the root vegetables down to store in jars sealed with wax. Inside, the warmth held. The hearth glowed steady. Evelyn stood at the table, sleeves pushed past her elbows, peeling apples with practiced turns of the knife. Her fingers moved with the ease of someone who had found rhythm in the quiet. Dawson came through the door, brushing snow from his shoulders, the cold still clinging to his beard. He unpinned his coat and hung it near the fire. "Trap was sprung near the creek bend," he said. "Fox, looked like, took the bait and chewed free. We'll need more wire come spring." Evelyn said, dropping another peel into the pail. The snare line's thinning. I'll trade for it with the tanner in Rock Springs. He'll have extra. She nodded, then paused. I've been thinking on something. Dawson leaned against the edge of the hearth, eyes on her. Go on. There's a schoolhouse being built south of here, just a single room. They're looking for someone to teach come thaw. You'd do it. I would, if you thought it right. I reckon any child would be lucky to learn from you. She looked at him then, the apple halfway peeled in her hand, her eyes steady. It wouldn't be just reading and ciphering. I'd teach them how to listen, how to ask, how not to be afraid of their own minds. Dawson didn't speak for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and took the knife gently from her hand, setting it aside. You don't need my permission, Evelyn. I know. But I want your blessing. He took her hands in his. You have both. There was a knock at the door that afternoon, rare, this far from the main trail. Dawson opened it with a rifle within reach, but the man standing there was alone, wrapped in a wool coat and carrying a leather satchel. I'm Reverend Langley, he said, voice brittle from the cold. I was told there was a woman here, Evelyn Joans. Evelyn stepped into view. She's Evelyn Flannery now, Langley's eyes softened. I knew your mother before she passed. Evelyn's breath caught. You were in Fort Bridger, briefly. I was posted to Ogden later. Your mother helped my wife deliver our first child. I never forgot her. Evelyn opened the door wider. Come inside. You're frozen through. They gave him tea in a corner by the stove. He warmed his hands slowly, looking between them. I came because your father's words have traveled farther than he knows, Langley said. And not all of them were received kindly. Dawson's jaw tightened. He's sending men out again. No. He fell ill some weeks back. Fever took his legs. He's preaching still, but only to those who'll sit close enough to hear him whisper. Evelyn watched the flames flicker in the hearth. Why tell me? Because he named you as his shame, and I thought you should know that isn't how others see you. She said nothing for a long while. Then she stood, walked to the shelf and pulled down the sealed letter Dawson had found weeks earlier. She set it on the table. Take this back to him, she said. It's not forgiveness, but it's the truth. Langley nodded. I'll see it delivered. That night, as the wind rose and snow pressed hard against the shutters, Dawson sat beside her on the floor, their backs against the hearth. Evelyn leaned into his side, her head against his shoulder. You sure you want to teach? He asked quietly. I'm sure. I want to build something that lasts beyond a season. He rested his cheek against her hair. Then we'll find a way to ride out together each morning. I'll see you safely there. I'm not afraid anymore. I know, he said, but I still want to ride with you. Spring came slow and wet. The ground thawed beneath a crust of old snow, and the creek ran high with melt. Evelyn planted her kale and onions in neat rows, covering them with straw as Dawson built a cold frame from discarded window panes. The schoolhouse opened in May, and Evelyn rode there 3 days each week, with Dawson seeing her off and waiting for her return. The children brought her wildflowers and questions, and she gave them stories and the freedom to wonder. By midsummer, the blackberry canes had taken root, curling along the fence like green ink on a page. Dawson built a bench beneath the tallest pine overlooking the creek bend, and some evenings they sat there, watching the sun dip low behind the hills. One afternoon she found him there, carving something into the post beside the bench. She stepped behind him, reading over his shoulder. It was a name, Flannery. He looked up, thought it was time to stake it proper. She rested her hand on his back. This land knows us now, and we know each other. That night they lay beneath the open window, stars flickering through the high branches. Evelyn's hand rested over his chest, her breath warm against his shoulder. I used to think I'd have to earn peace, she said. That I'd have to fight for it my whole life. "You don't have to fight anymore," Dawson said. She turned her face toward his. "I know. It's already here." They rose with the sun the next morning, their lives steady as the hills around them, their love shaped not by what they had escaped, but by what they had chosen each other, every day without fear or condition. Years passed. The blackberry canes bore fruit thick and sweet. The schoolhouse grew, and children spoke her name with fondness long after they'd grown. Dawson's hands grew rougher, his hair silvered at the temples, but his eyes never changed when he looked at her. And always they returned to the bench beneath the pine, where their name was carved into the wood, and the wind carried no judgment, only the quiet promise of a life well loved.